we have management here. And I do want to note as a counterpoint, too, that in the past 2 years, this current fiscal year and the previous one, we've had pretty much a record number of new drugs coming through the FDA. So it's actually, for the first time in the time I've been covering the industry, conceivable that these trends are starting to change. I want to start with Paul because one of the biggest upticks on that long slide down we saw on the ERUM's law chart came when HIV drugs first hit the market. And that was one of our best examples of medicines being approved quickly and rapidly, and you were one of the key players there. Is this problem, Paul, getting worse or better? How are we doing? Are we facing an exponential trend line like we saw on that chart, or are things changing?
I think I'm convinced things are changing. Recently, we at J&J, we had close to 12 drugs. We have 12 drugs which we got approved. We are back to growth. In the third quarter, we grew 11%. And we are on a trajectory to bringing back a significant number of new drugs. What has happened, I think, is that in the 80s and the 90s, we did pharmacology research in getting drugs from pharmacology to the clinic to patients. Then in the new decade, in 2000, we had the genome, human genome, and everyone thought that we were going to accelerate drug discovery by having all that information. But what we actively did is put back from pharmacology to targets almost 10 years. And from the genome to targets and validation of targets and pharmacology, it's like 10 years. And from there to patients in the market is 10 years. So we created a gap to get to, but now we're being able to deploy significantly better science. We have the know-how on biomarkers, we have the know-how on new targets, and I'm convinced that at this moment there is going to be a significant increase of new products coming to the market. Probably more targeted products, much more specific products for cancer. I think HIV was one of the first examples how the use of biomarkers and accelerated development yielded a significant number of drugs. If you look to the benefit of society, if you go back to 85, life expectancy in HIV was 2 years when you were diagnosed. Today, it's probably lifelong minus 2 years. Is there benefit of our industry? I think there is an exceptional benefit of our industry for what we do to our R&D. And much more to come in cancer, in Alzheimer's, in so many diseases, resistant disease, antibacteria. We as an industry, we are an essential part of healthcare. And I believe that with the good research, the good science there is today, we'll see a resurgence of new drugs, and I think our industry will prosper.
George, what do you think?
Well, I know panels are most interesting when they're controversial, but I have to completely,
we'll get there.
I have to completely agree. If you look at the last 6 years of that ERUM's graph, it's essentially a flat line, right? It's not going down exponentially for that period of time. And I think what Paul said is exactly right. I think the industry and the scientific community as a whole wasted a lot of time on the new genomics technologies when they were first available because they were exciting. They opened up new areas of investigation and people jumped on them, but they were new, they were immature, people didn't know how to use them. And so there was time, there was money wasted. Now the technologies are way better than they were. People have now understand how to use them. And we're seeing the fruits of that now. And I'm convinced that we have bottomed out and that research productivity is on its way back.
Michaela, you actually have a company where you have managed to demonstrate a little of this. We've certainly seen some changes at Pfizer. How do you see the introduction of these new technologies, George is playing out, actually impacting your ability to develop drugs, and what kind of drugs do you develop?
So I'm very excited about this sea change in biomedical innovation that Paul and George spoke to. And we use the term precision medicine to coin the ability now to rapidly understand some of the underlying causes of disease, underpinned by thousandfold rapid pace in how you can sequence the genome. George spoke about 10 years ago with the decoding of the genome, it took years and billions to sequence the genome. Today, you speak about a week and thousands of dollars. So the pace of that technology now opens up ability to identify more rapidly human-relevant disease target, affect the curve from the introduction when it comes to success rate, and select patient populations that are the right one for that type of disease course.
Talk about the Xalkori example, because that's an example where the drug was pretty much going to fail, and those technologies changed the path.
Absolutely. So Xalkori is a drug that we got approved in, targets 5% of lung cancer patients. And if you would have performed a traditional R&D, like we saw on the graphs 10 years ago, it would have been a drug reviewed as a project to close. But the ability to work, first of all, with external key leaders in cancer genomics, it was possible to identify a small group of patients that has dramatic efficacy, where you get response rates that you haven't seen, way above 50%, and meaningful long periods of disease control. And it's really a drug that uses concomitant patient selection, diagnostics, and drug moving through the regulatory process. And it's also emphasized the biomedical community embrace together how to use these technologies. We had a very productive dialogue with the FDA as one example how regulatory science also comes into play in this space. And I shared the view with Paul that these are examples now in cancer, but we will see them move into other diseases, immune inflammation. We start to see the power in vaccines where we can sequence bacteria and viruses and select the right targets to go for. And in the end, we provide much more impactful outcome, which allow us to get the reward from payers. And we would like to see this new era of biomedical innovation to be a solution for the healthcare economy and not a problem, to allow cost to be taken out in other systems, because we need to remember that drugs are a minority of these trillions of healthcare costs.
Tony, so do you think the problem's getting better, and how do you think about making sure that a drug that you're doing R&D on is going to add value for your company? I mean, for you in particular, for Onyx, you can't afford to be launching things that aren't going to get out there and work. I mean, how do you think about?
So I'm probably as optimistic as my colleagues on the panel for a couple of reasons. I think first of all, the opportunity to watch the vectors for personalized medicine and targeted therapies cross is really a very exciting and probably unprecedented time. So science is actually bringing to us a number of both technologies and new ways of thinking that will cause us as an industry to respond. So let's say that's a premise. And what I mean by that is it's an opportunity for us to redesign the way we do drug discovery and drug development, and not only race drugs to market faster, particularly when there's a clear biomarker, but also look for ways to collaborate more broadly with regulatory agencies around the world, with academia, with our colleagues in industry to ensure that these therapies are coming quickly. So to your point about creating value for the company, I think it actually starts ultimately with the test question for all of us, which is who do we expect will benefit from the innovations and the therapies that we're bringing forward? How is it that we can actually make a substantial, not incremental, but substantial improvement in the health of patients? And if we work our way backwards, we'll actually figure out the appropriate use for genomic markers and other biomarkers. We'll figure out the appropriate way for these new innovations to come forward, and that will create value. It's the doing well by doing good mantra that we abide by in the industry. And at Onyx specifically, because we don't have scientific discovery, we've got global development but not discovery, we have to be particularly careful where we place our resources. They're precious. We're a biotechnology company, and as such, every dollar has to count. So we're looking for this intersection between precision medicine and genomics.
Now, Is the one question I do think we have to ask after, particularly after the last decade, is the industry organized right? And one of the first things that comes up there is the question of scale. Is scale a problem when you're doing R&D? I'll start with George.
Some parts of R&D benefit from scale, and other parts of R&D suffer from scale, I think.
And what's the net effect, do you think?
Oh, it depends. I think, look, research, I don't think research scales well. That in any research organization that I've ever been associated with, there are a few key individuals who are responsible for the majority of the progress. And research is still people-driven. They use all the new technologies, but you're still depending on people to make those decisions. You have to know who's making good decisions, who's being political, who's willing to make hard decisions and admit when their project isn't working, and any number of things. The larger the organization, the harder it is to know that. And then I think you sometimes tend to impose process as on top of that. Development absolutely benefits from scale, being able to do it on the worldwide basis, having the sophistication that you have in large pharma companies is absolutely a critical advantage. And some of the new technologies are expensive, you know, and to bring them in-house and use them widely, I think takes some deep pockets. So parts of it scale very well, parts of it don't. I think your success depends on, and we were talking about this just before, how you take advantage of those things that are advantages for you, given the scale that you have. Pfizer has a very different set of advantages from us, probably.
And Michael, how do you deal with this question? Because everyone now is just wondering, well, wait, Pfizer's sitting right there, and they're really big.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with the question of making sure that scale is working for research? Because Pfizer before you is often held up as an example of it being a problem.
So you have to recognize that there are strengths and weaknesses of being a large company, and you have to play and amplify your strengths and mitigate what could be perceived as weaknesses. So George spoke about the discovery phase is better often pursued in smaller groups, and we have taken an intentional step to create small biotech-like units which are really have ownership for the early phase of discovering new causes of disease. On the other hand, we would like to use our scale, not only in late-stage development, where we have tremendous reach globally, but also in certain technology. So one example, antibody-drug conjugate that looks like a new emerging drug class requires outstanding knowledge about sophisticated chemistry, how you conjugate small molecules to antibodies, how you generate antibodies to a subset of tumor cells. And it's very few, if any, companies that can embrace those technologies. And we have intentionally built up a proprietary technology platform that allowed us to really move swiftly into this field. One final comment, Matt, which relates to the ability to integrate science and business in a large company. In vaccines, we have been traditionally a very successful player in infectious diseases, pneumococcal disease prevention, where we have really contributed broadly. We developed some technologies, but at the same time, another part of the company were interested in smoking cessation, and we developed a drug called Chantix from the neuroscience space. And an idea was born to use a vaccine with our sophisticated technology to raise really high level of antibodies that could neutralize multiple cigarettes of delivered nicotine. And that wouldn't happen in a small company, and we're just now in patients trying to translate this idea to reality. So I hope that gave you a few examples. Play intentionally on your strengths in a large company and be aware of their weaknesses and mitigate them.
So that would be a smoking vaccine, just to make it clear to everyone.
Isn't it cool, right?
Paul, how do you deal with this problem?
Well, I lived in the two worlds. I started my own biotech companies in '96 with $35,000 and 5 people. Yeah?
Which you would use fewer. You would stay at that size now, right?
And we were able to be agile, fast, collaborative. But then we got to 2 amazing new drugs. And the last year I was independent, I spent $80 million with my company going to phase 2A. But then you need to go into global development, and we had 2 HIV drugs. The second year I was back in J&J, we spent $400 million capital globally to develop 2 HIV drugs. And I'm very happy that that complementarity between a small company and a large company is there, because otherwise the drugs would never have been there if I would have thought I could do it on my own. The global development is absolutely needed to be able to develop the drug. You need the patients, the centers, but more important, I think you need the global markets to pay for drugs in order to justify the investment. And that's why I think then back in a large company, what you try to do is to make sure that you play on both strengths. We have a large development organization with huge capabilities to do global development. There it's about efficiency, speed, it's about quality, making sure that you deliver the trials. And then in a more decentralized and entrepreneurial way, you give teams of people the opportunity to be a biotech company-like organization and foster research there. And then what I think is also important is you have to be very modest in your thinking when you do research. You can never discover in your own organization the best thing in the world, almost never. If you think you can do that, you fail from the start. So discovery of new drugs is today extensive collaborations with academic centers, with biotech companies, with technology companies, and so it has changed from being a research in a lab with 4 walls where you say, let's generate our patents, to a global activity. Yeah? It is connections in the world with the best science, in the end, delivers the best product. And that is, and that's how I think decentralized, entrepreneurial, giving the people the empowerment to do that. But when it comes to development, you make sure you have a global and very strong organization.